The carriage wheels stopped turning, and Alina Whitmore's hands went cold. Somewhere behind her, her mother's voice cut through the evening air, sharp as a blade drawn too fast. "Sit still. Do not speak unless spoken to. Tonight belongs to your sister." Alina had heard those words so many times in her 20 years that they no longer stung. They simply settled into her chest like stones dropped into still water, sinking without a splash, without a sound, leaving only weight behind. The Ashworth estate rose before them, tall and golden with candlelight, every window glowing like a watching eye. Carriages lined the drive in a long, glittering row, and laughter spilled out from the open doors, mixing with the smell of roses and warm wax. Alina sat very still in her seat, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and watched her sister Charlotte check her reflection one final time in the small mirror she always carried. Charlotte was beautiful in the way that made rooms go quiet. Golden curls, a laugh that seemed to invite everyone into it, and a confidence that had been built, brick by brick, since the day she was born the elder daughter of a family with more pride than money. Everything in the Whitmore household existed to lift Charlotte higher. The best dresses went to her first. The finest lessons in music and dance were hers. And whenever a room needed to be impressed, Alina was placed at the edge of it, told to smile, told to stay quiet, told never to outshine. Their father, Edmund Whitmore, cleared his throat as the carriage door opened. "Remember, girls, tonight is important. The Duke of Ashworth does not attend many balls. If Charlotte can catch his eye, our family's troubles are over." Alina's stomach tightened, though not from excitement. She understood the family situation better than anyone gave her credit for. Their father's investments had failed twice in the last 3 years. Their small estate carried debts that grew heavier by the season. A match between Charlotte and a duke would fix everything, and Alina had accepted long ago that her role in that fixing was simply to disappear into the background and let it happen. She stepped down from the carriage last, as always, and followed her family up the wide stone steps into a hall so bright it made her blink. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of light. Musicians played somewhere beyond the crowd, their music weaving between the voices of 100 guests. Alina's mother, Margaret Whitmore, gave her one final look before they crossed into the ballroom, a look that said everything without a single word. "Stay small. Stay quiet. Let your sister shine." Alina did exactly that. She found a spot near the tall windows at the far end of the room, half hidden by a curtain of pale blue silk, and there she remained as the evening unfolded around her like a play she had not been given a part in. Charlotte moved through the crowd like water finding its path, laughing at every joke, complimenting every gown, curtsying to every gentleman who asked for a dance. She was radiant, and Alina, watching from her quiet corner, felt no jealousy, only a strange, tired familiarity. This was simply how things were. From her position by the window, Alina could see almost the entire ballroom. She watched the patterns of the dance, the way certain gentlemen circled certain young ladies like they were solving puzzles, the way mothers stood near the walls with the same watchful hunger in their eyes that she recognized in her own mother's face. She noticed things other people missed because they were too busy being noticed themselves. She noticed the young man who kept glancing at the door as though waiting for someone who might never come. She noticed the older woman near the refreshment table who quietly slipped a second helping of cake into her handkerchief for later. She noticed, too, the moment the entire room seemed to shift, like a held breath, when a name was announced at the top of the stairs. The Duke of Ashworth. Alina had heard stories about him before tonight, whispered over tea and traded like currency among the women of her small social circle. He was said to be cold, distant, uninterested in marriage despite being one of the most eligible men in the country. Some said he had loved once and lost it. Others said he simply had no interest in love at all, only in his estates, his horses, and his solitude. Whatever the truth, his presence tonight had clearly been the reason for half the gowns in the room, including, Alina suspected, her sister's. He was tall, with dark hair and an expression that gave nothing away, the kind of face that made people want to guess what lay behind it. He moved through the crowd without hurry, greeting people with polite nods, never lingering long enough for conversation to take root. Alina watched Charlotte notice him immediately, watched her mother's spine straighten, watched her father's chest puff slightly with renewed hope. Charlotte made her move within minutes, gliding toward the Duke with the practiced grace of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times in her mind. Alina could not hear what was said, but she could read the shape of it easily enough. A curtsy. An introduction. A compliment, likely about the estate or the music. Charlotte's laugh, bright and performed, rising above the general noise of the room. The Duke responded with polite words of his own, brief and measured, the kind of response that could mean anything or nothing at all. Alina watched her sister's face carefully, watched the small flicker of uncertainty cross it when the Duke's attention did not linger the way she had clearly hoped. He excused himself soon after, offering a slight bow, and moved on into the crowd, leaving Charlotte standing there for a moment longer than she likely wished, before she recovered her smile and turned to speak with someone else nearby. Alina felt a small, unexpected flicker of sympathy for her sister. Charlotte carried a weight of her own, even if it looked different from Alina's. The expectation to succeed, to charm, to save the family through marriage alone, was its own kind of prison, dressed up in silk and jewels so that no one thought to call it what it was. The evening continued. Alina remained by her window, watching the dancing, watching the careful games people played with each other, the small alliances and rivalries hidden beneath polite conversation. She had grown skilled over the years at making herself invisible in rooms like this. It was not difficult. People rarely looked twice at a quiet young woman standing near a curtain, especially when there was a beautiful, laughing sister nearby to hold their attention instead. What Alina did not notice, because she had trained herself so thoroughly not to be noticed, was that she herself was being watched. The Duke of Ashworth had crossed paths with dozens of young women that evening, all of them eager, all of them performing versions of themselves they believed he might want to see. He had grown weary of it years ago, the constant calculation in every smile directed at him, the way conversations always seemed to circle back to his title, his fortune, his estates. He had come tonight only because his aunt, who hosted the ball, had insisted, and because avoiding society entirely had begun to draw more attention than attending it occasionally. He had noticed the young woman by the window early in the evening, though he could not have said exactly why his eyes kept drifting back to her. She was not dressed as elaborately as the other young ladies. Her gown was a simple pale green, well-made, but without the excessive decoration that seemed to be the fashion of the season. She stood apart from the crowd, not awkwardly, but with a kind of stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as though she had chosen her position carefully. What struck him most was the way she watched the room. Not with the hungry, searching look he had grown accustomed to seeing on the faces of young women hoping to catch his attention, but with quiet, careful observation, the way one might watch a river to understand its currents. She seemed to be studying everyone, missing nothing, and yet asking nothing of any of it for herself. He found himself curious about her, in a way he had not felt curious about anyone in a long while. He did not approach her immediately. Years of caution had taught him not to act on impulse, especially in matters involving young women at balls hosted by relatives eager to see him married. Instead, he continued through the evening as expected, exchanging brief words with old acquaintances, enduring the introductions his aunt insisted on making, all the while keeping half his attention on the quiet young woman by the window. He learned her name from a passing comment between two older women near the refreshment table, women who did not realize he was close enough to hear. The younger Whitmore girl, one of them said, her tone carrying the particular dismissiveness reserved for those considered unremarkable. Quiet little thing, not much to say for herself, unlike her sister. Alina Whitmore. The name settled into his memory with unexpected weight. As the evening wore on, the ballroom grew warmer, the crowd thicker, the music louder. Alina began to feel the familiar ache of standing still for too long, the quiet exhaustion of hours spent making herself smaller than she was. She glanced toward the tall glass doors that led out to the terrace, half hidden behind another curtain, and made a decision that felt small in the moment, but would prove to matter more than she could have imagined. She slipped out into the night air. The terrace was empty, cooler than the crowded ballroom, lit only by the moon and a scattering of lanterns hung along the stone railing. Alina breathed in deeply, grateful for the quiet, for the space to simply exist without being watched, without being told to be smaller. She walked to the edge of the terrace and looked out over the dark gardens below, where hedges had been trimmed into careful shapes, and a fountain caught the moonlight in scattered silver pieces. She did not hear the footsteps behind her, until it was too late to slip back inside unnoticed. "Forgive the intrusion," a voice said, calm and low. "I did not mean to disturb your solitude." Alina turned quickly, her heart lifting into her throat, and found herself facing the Duke of Ashworth himself, standing only a few steps away, his expression unreadable in the low light. She had spent an entire evening avoiding notice, and now, in the quiet dark of an empty terrace, she had somehow drawn the attention of the one person in the entire ballroom she had never expected to see her at all. "Your Grace," Alina managed, dropping into a quick, unsteady curtsy. "I did not realize anyone had followed me out." "I did not follow," he said, a faint trace of something almost like amusement touching his voice. "I simply needed air, the same as you, it seems." Alina straightened slowly, unsure whether to excuse herself or remain. Every instinct told her to retreat, to return to her quiet corner where she belonged, where she would not risk drawing attention that was meant for her sister. But something in the Duke's manner, the plainness of his words, the absence of any performance in them, made her hesitate. "I should return inside," she said, though she made no move to do so. "You are welcome to," he replied, "though I confess I find the garden more interesting than the ballroom tonight." Alina allowed herself a small, surprised smile before she could stop it. "That is a rather bold thing to say at your own aunt's ball." "It is only bold if someone repeats it," he said, and for the first time that evening something like real warmth entered his voice. "I trust you will not." "I have no one to tell," Alina admitted, more honestly than she intended. "My family is rather occupied elsewhere." The Duke studied her for a long moment, and Alina felt herself flush under the weight of his attention, unused as she was to being looked at so directly, so completely. Most people looked past her, or through her, or at the space just beside her where her sister usually stood. The Duke looked only at her, and it left her feeling strangely exposed, as though he could see far more than she wished to reveal. "You were watching the room all evening," he said, "from the window." Alina's breath caught slightly. "You noticed." "It was difficult not to," he said. "Most people at a ball wish only to be seen. You seemed content simply to observe." "There is a great deal to observe," Alina said carefully, choosing her words the way she always did, weighing them before she let them out into the world. "Sometimes it is easier to understand a room by watching it than by joining it." "And what did you understand, watching this one?" Alina considered the question seriously, aware that he seemed to be asking it seriously as well, not as a game or a flirtation, but as a genuine curiosity. "That everyone here is performing something," she said slowly. "Even the ones who look most at ease. Especially those, perhaps." The Duke's expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that Alina could not quite name. "And you," he asked, "are you performing as well?" The question landed harder than she expected. She thought of her mother's warning in the carriage, of the years of practice she had put into making herself invisible, into folding her own wants and opinions into something small enough to fit in the corners of rooms without disturbing anyone. Was that not its own kind of performance, the performance of disappearing? "I suppose everyone performs in their own way," she said finally. "Mine is simply quieter than most." The Duke seemed to consider this answer for a long moment before nodding slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already suspected. "It is a rare thing," he said, "to meet someone honest about that, even in such a small confession." Alina did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing. And for a while they simply stood together at the edge of the terrace, looking out over the dark garden in a silence that felt, strangely, comfortable rather than awkward. Eventually the Duke spoke again, his tone lighter now. "Your sister danced a great deal this evening. Aliner's stomach tightened, the familiar reflex of protecting Charlotte rising instinctively within her. She is well loved in company, Aliner said carefully. She has always known how to fill a room. And you? I fill the spaces she leaves empty, Aliner said, and though she meant it plainly, without bitterness, she heard the shape of her own life in the words as soon as they left her mouth, and something in her chest ached quietly at the sound of it. The Duke did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. That seems a difficult way to live. It is simply the way things are, Aliner said, and this time there was a faint edge beneath the words, a small crack in the calm she usually wore so carefully. It is not for me to complain of it. I did not ask if you complained, he said. I asked if it was difficult. Aliner looked at him then, truly looked at him, and found none of the polite distance she had expected from a man of his rank and reputation. There was only quiet attention, steady and unhurried, the kind of attention she had almost forgotten existed, the kind that did not want anything from her except an honest answer. Yes, she admitted softly, it is difficult, but difficult things are not always unbearable, one learns to carry them. The Duke's expression softened in a way that surprised her, something almost gentle passing across his features before he composed himself again. I imagine you carry a great deal, he said. Before Aliner could answer, voices drifted toward them from the ballroom doors, laughter and the rustle of skirts announcing that others had begun to wander out onto the terrace as well, seeking the same cool air Aliner had sought earlier. The Duke stepped back slightly, putting a respectful distance between them, and Aliner felt the loss of the moment's privacy more keenly than she expected. I should return to my family, she said quietly. Of course, the Duke replied, his voice returning to its earlier composed tone, though something in his eyes remained unchanged, still fixed on her with the same quiet attention as before. Thank you for the conversation, Miss Whitmore. Aliner blinked in surprise. You know my name. I make it a point to know the names of people worth remembering, he said simply, and before she could think of a response, he offered a brief, formal bow and turned to greet the guests now spilling out onto the terrace, his manner shifting instantly back into the polished, distant composure she had watched him wear all evening. Aliner stood there a moment longer, her heart beating strangely fast, before she gathered herself and slipped back inside through a side door, avoiding the crowd gathering on the terrace. She found her way back to her quiet corner by the window, though the room felt different to her now, brighter somehow, though nothing about it had actually changed. She did not see the Duke again for the rest of the evening, though twice she caught him glancing toward her window from across the crowded room, brief glances that lasted no longer than a breath before he returned his attention to whoever stood before him. Each time, Aliner felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, quickly followed by a firm, practical voice in her mind, reminding her that dukes did not marry the quiet younger sisters of families drowning in debt. Dukes married women like Charlotte, women who knew how to fill a room, women who had been trained their whole lives for exactly this purpose. By the time the Whitmore family climbed back into their carriage that night, exhausted and quiet in the aftermath of the ball, Charlotte was already recounting the evening's triumphs to their eager parents, describing every dance, every compliment, every moment of attention she had gathered throughout the night. Their mother listened with delighted attention, occasionally clasping her hands together with satisfaction, while their father nodded along, clearly calculating the family's improving prospects with each detail. Aliner sat quietly in her usual place, watching the dark countryside pass by the carriage window, and said nothing at all about the terrace, about the conversation that had unsettled something deep and long buried inside her, about the strange, careful way the Duke of Ashworth had looked at her, as though she were someone worth truly seeing. It did not matter, she told herself firmly. It could not matter. Whatever had happened on that terrace was a small, private moment, meaningless in the larger picture of her family's future, meaningless in a world that had already decided, long before tonight, exactly what role she was meant to play. But even as she told herself this, over and over, in rhythm with the rocking of the carriage, some quiet, stubborn part of her heart refused entirely to believe it. 3 days after the ball, A messenger arrived at the Whitmore house carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain string. Margaret Whitmore nearly dropped her teacup in her hurry to reach the door, certain that such an unexpected delivery could only mean good news regarding Charlotte's prospects. The parcel was addressed simply to Miss Whitmore, without a first name attached, and this small omission caused a flurry of excitement in the household. Margaret assumed immediately that it must be intended for Charlotte, since she was, after all, the eldest, and therefore the natural bearer of the family name in matters of correspondence. Charlotte accepted the parcel with barely concealed delight, untying the string with eager fingers while her mother and father watched, and Alina stood quietly near the doorway, saying nothing, expecting nothing. Inside the parcel was a book, elegantly bound in dark green leather, a volume of poetry that had clearly been chosen with care rather than purchased at random. A small note accompanied it, written in a firm, unhurried hand. I believe you mentioned an interest in observation and quiet study. This collection considers both rather beautifully. I hope you find it worth your time. There was no signature, only a small, elegant seal pressed into the wax, the crest of the House of Ashworth. Charlotte's excitement dimmed slightly as she read the note aloud, confusion crossing her face. I do not recall mentioning any interest in poetry to the Duke, she said slowly. Nor do I recall speaking to him of observation or quiet study. Their mother waved this concern away quickly, eager to preserve the excitement of the moment. Perhaps he simply assumed such interest suited a young lady of refinement, she said. It does not matter the reasoning, only the result. The Duke has sent you a gift, Charlotte. This is a very promising sign indeed. Alina, standing quietly by the doorway, felt her heart begin to beat unevenly as she recognized, with sudden and complete certainty, exactly whose interests the note actually described. She said nothing, offering no correction, no clarification, though the words on the page seemed to burn themselves into her memory. Observation. Quiet study. These were her words, spoken softly on a dark terrace 3 nights ago to a man who had apparently remembered every one of them. She excused herself soon after, claiming a headache, and retreated to her small room at the back of the house, where she sat by the window for a long while, turning the strange, quiet fact over and over in her mind. The Duke had not forgotten their conversation. He had, in fact, remembered it well enough to choose a gift specifically suited to what she had told him about herself, and he had sent it addressed only to Miss Whitmore, perhaps assuming, perhaps hoping, that the household would understand exactly which sister he meant. They had not understood, and Alina found herself unable in that moment to correct them. It was easier, she told herself, to let Charlotte believe the book was hers. It caused no harm. It kept the peace. It maintained the fragile order of the household, where Charlotte's happiness and success were treated as the family's shared purpose, and Alina's role remained exactly where it had always been, quiet and supportive, asking for nothing. And yet that night, unable to sleep, Alina crept quietly down the hallway and found the book resting on the small table in the parlor, where Charlotte had left it after reading only the first few pages before declaring the poetry rather dull for her taste. Alina picked it up carefully, carried it back to her room, and read late into the night by the light of a single candle, losing herself completely in verses about quiet rivers, still gardens, and the particular beauty of things that did not demand to be noticed in order to matter. She did not think, reading those pages, that the Duke could possibly have known how deeply the words would settle into her. But something in the careful selection, in the quiet understanding behind each poem he had chosen, told her otherwise. The following week, an invitation arrived for a smaller gathering, a private dinner hosted by the Duke's aunt, the same relative who had hosted the ball. The invitation named the entire Whitmore family, but Margaret immediately began planning the evening around Charlotte, selecting her finest remaining gown, arranging for her hair to be styled by the one skilled maid the family could still afford, and reminding Alina once again of her role for the evening. "Support your sister," Margaret said firmly, adjusting the collar of Alina's plainer gown with brisk, efficient hands. "Smile when appropriate. Speak only when spoken to. This dinner could decide everything for this family, Alina. Do not complicate it." Elinor nodded quietly, as she always did, though something inside her had shifted since the ball. Some small, stubborn seed of self she could not quite silence anymore, no matter how firmly her mother's words pressed down upon it. The dinner was smaller than the ball, more intimate, with perhaps 20 guests seated around a long table beneath soft candlelight. Elinor found herself placed, as expected, near the far end of the table, well away from the places of honor near the Duke, while Charlotte was seated much closer, positioned carefully by their mother's earlier correspondence with the hostess to ensure maximum opportunity for conversation. For much of the meal, Elinor kept her eyes on her plate, speaking only when addressed directly, offering polite, brief responses to the elderly gentleman seated beside her, who seemed far more interested in discussing his gout than in anything Elinor might have to say. She caught occasional glimpses of the Duke further down the table, engaged in what appeared to be polite, measured conversation with Charlotte and the guests around her, his expression composed and unreadable, giving away nothing of what he might be thinking. It was only after the meal, when the guests retired to the drawing room for conversation and light entertainment, that Elinor found herself unexpectedly drawn into the evening's events. The hostess, eager to entertain her guests, suggested a small game, a discussion of a recent essay circulating among fashionable society, concerning the nature of true intelligence and whether it could be measured by wit alone or required something deeper, quieter, and harder to display. Several guests offered opinions, most of them agreeing readily with whatever seemed most flattering to say in mixed company, until the hostess, perhaps sensing the conversation had grown too polite to be interesting, turned unexpectedly toward Elinor. "And you, Miss Elinor," she said kindly, "you have been quiet all evening. What do you think? Is true intelligence loud, or is it something quieter?" Elinor felt every eye in the room shift toward her, including, she was acutely aware, the Duke's. Her instinct was to offer a brief, safe answer, something short enough to satisfy the question without drawing further attention. But something in the quiet challenge of the question, combined with the memory of a terrace conversation still fresh in her mind, made her pause and consider her answer more honestly than she intended. "I think loudness is often mistaken for intelligence," she said slowly, choosing her words with the same careful attention she always gave them. "But the loudest voice in a room is not always the wisest one. Sometimes true understanding requires patience, observation, the willingness to listen more than one speaks. It is simply less noticeable, which does not make it less real." A brief silence followed her words, and Elinor felt a flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks, certain she had spoken too much, too honestly, drawing exactly the kind of attention her mother had warned her against. But then, from further down the table, the Duke spoke, his voice calm and thoughtful. "I agree entirely," he said. "Some of the sharpest minds I have encountered belong to people who rarely raise their voices at all." His eyes found Elinor's across the room, brief but unmistakable, and something passed between them in that glance, quiet and private, a shared understanding that no one else in the room seemed to notice, though Elinor felt certain her mother's sharp attention had caught something of it nonetheless. The conversation moved on quickly after that, other guests offering their own opinions, the moment passing as though it had never happened at all. But Elinor carried the weight of it with her for the rest of the evening, replaying the Duke's words over and over in her mind, wondering whether she had imagined the particular warmth in his voice when he spoke them, wondering whether her mother had truly noticed the exchange, or whether Elinor's own anxious imagination had simply invented significance where none existed. Later that night, Charlotte returned to the topic during their carriage ride home, her voice carrying a note of confusion rather than jealousy. "It was strange, was it not," she said, watching the passing countryside through the carriage window, "how the Duke agreed so readily with your answer tonight. He barely spoke 2 words to me all evening, yet he seemed quite interested in what you had to say." Their mother, seated across from them, waved this observation away with practiced dismissal. "The Duke was simply being polite," she said firmly. "Dukes are trained in courtesy toward all young ladies present, regardless of preference. You must not read too much into such small moments, Charlotte. Focus instead on securing another invitation, another opportunity to make your true impression felt. Charlotte nodded slowly, accepting her mother's explanation, though Alina noticed a small, thoughtful crease remained between her sister's brows for the rest of the ride home, as though some quiet doubt had settled there and refused entirely to leave. Alina said nothing throughout the exchange, staring out her own window at the passing darkness, her heart caught between two competing feelings she could not fully separate from one another. There was a small, fragile happiness blooming somewhere deep inside her, unfamiliar and almost frightening in its intensity, at the thought that someone, finally, truly saw her. And alongside it, a heavier, more familiar dread, the certain knowledge that whatever was beginning to grow between herself and the Duke of Ashworth would eventually have to be reckoned with by her family, by her sister, and by a world that had already decided, long before any of this began, exactly which sister deserved to shine. In the weeks that followed, the Whitmore household settled into a rhythm built entirely around the hope of a match between Charlotte and the Duke. Margaret spoke of little else, planning future gowns, discussing which flowers might suit a summer wedding, calculating aloud how quickly the family's debts could be cleared once the engagement was formally announced. Edmund, though quieter in his enthusiasm, began speaking with renewed confidence to the men he owed money to, hinting at improving fortunes without stating anything directly, allowing the assumption of Charlotte's coming success to work in his favor even before it existed. Alina watched this unfold with a growing unease she could not fully name. She had not seen the Duke since the dinner party, though she thought of their conversation on the terrace often, and of the careful attention in his eyes when he had agreed with her answer that evening in the drawing room. She told herself repeatedly that such moments meant little, that a man of his position could offer polite attention to any young woman without intending anything further by it. But some quiet, persistent part of her refused entirely to believe this, no matter how firmly she tried to convince herself otherwise. Another invitation arrived nearly 2 weeks later, this time to a small garden gathering hosted by a family friend of the Ashworths, an afternoon affair involving light refreshments, quiet conversation, and a walk through carefully tended gardens known throughout the county for their beauty. Once again, Margaret focused every preparation on Charlotte, selecting her gown with painstaking care, arranging for fresh flowers to be woven into her hair, reminding her repeatedly of the importance of the occasion. "Alina, are you certain that dress is suitable?" her mother asked, eyeing Alina's simple gray gown with faint disapproval as the family prepared to depart. "It seems rather plain for such an occasion." "I was under the impression I was meant to remain unnoticed," Alina said quietly, without any real bitterness in her tone, simply stating what she understood to be true. Margaret's expression flickered briefly, something like discomfort crossing her face before she composed herself again. "That is not precisely what I meant," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I simply meant you ought to look presentable, as befits our family's standing. There is no need to draw attention, simply appear well cared for." Alina said nothing further, though the contradiction in her mother's words settled uncomfortably in her chest. Appear well cared for, but do not draw attention. Support your sister, but do not eclipse her. Exist within the family, but only in the smallest possible space it required of her. The garden gathering unfolded much as such events usually did. Small groups of guests wandering along stone paths between carefully trimmed hedges, admiring roses and discussing matters of little consequence. Alina walked slightly apart from the main group, as she often did, content to observe the gardens themselves rather than engage in the surrounding conversation, until she rounded a corner along a quiet path and found herself, quite unexpectedly, face to face with the Duke of Ashworth once again. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and something in the particular way he spoke her name, without needing to clarify which sister he meant, sent a small, unwelcome thrill through Alina's chest. "Your Grace," she replied, offering a small curtsy, "I did not expect to encounter you here." "I confess I was hoping to," he said simply, his directness catching her slightly off guard. "I noticed you walking alone and thought you might appreciate company that did not require performance." Alina allowed herself a small, genuine smile at this, the first true smile she had offered anyone in weeks. That is a rather accurate assessment of most gatherings, she admitted. They walked together for a while along the quiet garden path, their conversation drifting easily between topics, the poetry he had sent, which Alina confessed to having read entirely, though she did not clarify that her family believed the book belonged to Charlotte instead. The Duke listened with evident interest as she described her favorite verses, occasionally offering his own thoughts, and Alina found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, speaking freely and completely, without the constant careful calculation she applied to nearly every conversation she had. "You read it more closely than I expected," the Duke observed. "Most people thank a gift with polite vagueness. You seem to have truly considered it." "I found I could not help myself," Alina admitted. The poems felt as though they understood something about quiet observation that most people overlook entirely. "I chose it with that hope in mind," the Duke said quietly, and Alina felt her breath catch slightly at the implication carried within his words. The quiet confirmation that the book had indeed been chosen for her, understood by her, intended for exactly the kind of attention she had given it. Before Alina could respond, however, voices called out from further along the path, and moments later Charlotte appeared around the bend, accompanied by two other young ladies, her expression brightening immediately at the sight of the Duke. "Your Grace," she said warmly, offering a graceful curtsy. "I did not realize you had wandered this far from the main gathering." The Duke's expression shifted subtly, returning to the composed, polite distance Alina recognized from public settings. "Miss Whitmore," he said, addressing Charlotte with careful courtesy, "I was simply admiring the gardens." Charlotte's gaze moved briefly between the Duke and Alina, a flicker of confusion crossing her features before she recovered her smile. "Perhaps I might join you both," she offered, moving to walk alongside them as though the invitation had already been extended. The remainder of the walk proceeded with all three of them together, the easy, private quality of the earlier conversation between Alina and the Duke replaced by the more careful, public exchange required in Charlotte's presence. Alina fell quietly back into her familiar role, allowing Charlotte to lead the conversation, offering only brief responses when addressed directly, though she noticed, with a small, guilty flicker of satisfaction, that the Duke's attention returned to her more frequently than seemed strictly polite, given the circumstances. That evening, in the carriage ride home, Margaret's earlier good humor had curdled into something sharper, more suspicious. She waited until Charlotte had drifted into quiet conversation with their father about the afternoon's events before turning her attention fully to Alina, her voice low and pointed. "I noticed you walking with the Duke this afternoon. Before your sister arrived," Margaret said, her eyes fixed carefully on Alina's face, searching for something. "We happened to encounter one another on the garden path," Alina said carefully, keeping her voice as steady and neutral as she could manage. "And what precisely did you discuss?" "The gardens," Alina said, which was not entirely a lie, though it omitted a great deal. "The roses were particularly fine this season." Margaret's expression did not soften. "Alina," she said, her voice dropping lower still, quiet enough that only Alina could hear it clearly over the rattle of the carriage wheels. "I have watched you carefully over these past weeks. I have noticed the way the Duke's attention seems to drift toward you at gatherings where your sister ought to hold his focus entirely. I do not know what game you believe yourself to be playing, but I will not allow it to continue." "I am not playing any game, Mother," Alina said, a note of genuine hurt entering her voice despite her efforts to remain composed. "I have done nothing to seek his attention." "Perhaps not intentionally," Margaret said, though her tone suggested she did not fully believe this. "But intention matters little if the result remains the same. Your sister's future, this family's future, depends entirely on securing this match. I will not have you jeopardize it, whether through carelessness or through some misguided notion that you deserve consideration you were never meant to receive." The words struck Alina with a force that left her briefly unable to respond. the casual cruelty of them settling deep into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She stared out the carriage window at the passing darkness, blinking back tears she refused to let fall in front of her mother, and said nothing further for the remainder of the journey home. That night, alone in her room, Elinor sat for a long while by her window, staring out at the quiet darkness of the garden below, turning her mother's words over and over in her mind. Some misguided notion that you deserve consideration you were never meant to receive. The sentence lodged itself somewhere deep and painful, confirming everything she had always understood about her place within the family. And yet, for the first time, she found herself genuinely questioning whether that understanding had ever truly been fair. She thought of the Duke's steady attention, the careful way he listened when she spoke, the quiet confirmation in his eyes that he saw her clearly, completely, in a way no one else in her life had ever bothered to attempt. She thought of the poetry he had chosen specifically for her, understanding her interests without needing to be told directly. And she thought, with a small, aching sadness, that perhaps her mother was right to fear what was beginning between them, not because Elinor had done anything wrong, but because some part of her, however small, however carefully guarded, had begun to hope for something she had long ago convinced herself she was never permitted to want. The following morning, Elinor made a quiet decision, one she did not share with anyone in her family. She would withdraw herself from future gatherings wherever possible, offering polite excuses of headaches or minor illness, allowing Charlotte the space to pursue the Duke's attention without further complication. It was, she told herself firmly, the only fair path forward, the only way to protect her sister's future and preserve whatever fragile peace remained within their household. She did not yet understand that the Duke of Ashworth was not a man easily discouraged by absence, nor was he a man inclined to abandon an interest simply because circumstance made it inconvenient to pursue. True to her decision, Elinor began declining invitations wherever she reasonably could, citing headaches, fatigue, or the need to assist with household matters that had, in truth, never required her presence quite so urgently before. Margaret accepted these excuses without suspicion at first, relieved simply that Elinor seemed to be stepping back from whatever complication had been forming between herself and the Duke. Charlotte, for her part, seemed pleased by her sister's sudden absence from social gatherings, believing it granted her clearer opportunity to secure the Duke's attention without distraction. For nearly 2 weeks, the plan appeared to work exactly as Elinor intended. She remained at home during a small tea gathering hosted by one of her mother's acquaintances, and again during a musical evening organized by a family several miles distant. And each time, Charlotte returned home with updated reports of pleasant, if unremarkable, conversation with the Duke, conversation that Elinor noted, privately, never seemed to progress toward anything resembling genuine warmth or connection. "He asked after you again," Charlotte mentioned one evening, her tone carrying a faint note of confusion rather than jealousy, as she removed her gloves following a small dinner party Elinor had avoided by claiming a headache. "He inquired whether you were unwell, and seemed genuinely concerned when I told him you had been absent from recent gatherings." Elinor's heart lifted despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Did he say anything further?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral. Charlotte studied her sister for a long moment, something thoughtful and searching in her expression. "Only that he hoped you would recover soon," she said slowly. It seemed a rather particular concern for someone he has spoken with so briefly. Elinor offered no response beyond a small, noncommittal shrug, though she carried Charlotte's words with her for the rest of the evening, turning them over in her mind long after she had retired to her room, wondering whether her absence had truly been noticed, and if so, what that might mean. It was not long after this conversation that the Duke's persistence became impossible for Elinor to ignore entirely, regardless of her efforts to remove herself from his path. A small package arrived one morning, addressed once again simply to Miss Whitmore, though this time Elinor happened to be the one present when the messenger delivered it, her mother and sister having gone into the nearby village for the morning to attend to errands. Alina accepted the package herself, her curiosity overtaking any hesitation, and carried it quietly to her room before opening it. Inside was a small, carefully pressed collection of dried wildflowers, tied together with a simple ribbon, accompanied by a brief note in the Duke's now familiar handwriting. I recalled you mentioning an appreciation for things too quiet to be immediately noticed. These grow along the eastern edge of my property, overlooked by nearly everyone who walks past them. I thought you might understand their particular beauty better than most. Alina read the note several times, her chest tightening with an emotion she found difficult to name, somewhere between joy and fear, hope and dread. The Duke had clearly understood, from their brief exchange at the garden gathering, exactly what she meant regarding quiet, overlooked beauty, and he had taken the time to gather these small flowers himself, or arrange for their gathering, specifically with her in mind. She hid the flowers carefully among her belongings, pressing them further between the pages of a book she kept private from the rest of her family, and said nothing to anyone about the gift she had received. The Duke's attempts to seek her out did not end there. Over the following weeks, small opportunities continued to arise, moments engineered, Alina suspected, with careful deliberation on his part. He arranged, through his aunt, a visit to a local charitable event that required volunteers to help organize donated goods for families in need throughout the county. An event Alina had originally planned to attend before her decision to withdraw from social engagement, and one she ultimately could not bring herself to avoid, given her genuine wish to assist with the charitable work involved. She arrived expecting a large gathering of volunteers, and was surprised to find the group considerably smaller than anticipated. No more than a dozen people sorting through boxes of clothing and provisions within a modest hall on the outskirts of the county. The Duke was among them, dressed more plainly than she had ever seen him, sleeves rolled to his elbows as he helped carry heavy crates from a waiting cart into the hall. He noticed her arrival immediately, his expression brightening in a way he did not quite manage to conceal before composing himself into his usual measured calm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, approaching her with evident pleasure, "I did not expect to see you here." "I might say the same of you, Your Grace," Alina replied, unable to fully suppress her own smile at the unexpected sight of him engaged in such humble, practical work. "I find I prefer this sort of gathering to most others," he admitted, gesturing toward the crates and boxes surrounding them. "There is less performance required, and rather more purpose." They worked alongside one another for much of the afternoon, sorting donated clothing into careful piles, organizing provisions for distribution among families struggling through a difficult season. The work was simple, repetitive, and entirely without the social pressures Alina usually associated with gatherings involving the Duke, and she found herself relaxing into easy, genuine conversation as the hours passed. He asked about her interests beyond poetry, and Alina found herself describing, with growing enthusiasm, her fascination with the natural world, her habit of cataloging the various birds that visited her family's small garden throughout the changing seasons, a hobby she had never before shared with anyone outside her own private thoughts. The Duke listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, occasionally offering observations of his own regarding the wildlife on his own extensive property, and Alina felt, throughout their conversation, a growing sense of ease she had rarely experienced with anyone in her life. "You have never mentioned this to your family," he observed at one point, watching her carefully as she described a particular species of songbird she had recently identified. "There has never seemed to be room for it," Alina admitted before she could stop herself. "My family's attention tends to focus elsewhere." The Duke's expression grew more serious at this admission, something careful and considering crossing his features. "That seems a great waste," he said quietly. "Your observations are remarkably detailed. You clearly possess a genuine gift for careful attention." Alina felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, unused as she was to receiving such direct praise for anything she did or said. "Thank you," she managed, her voice quieter than she intended. As the afternoon drew to a close and volunteers began gathering their belongings to depart, the Duke found a brief moment alone with Alina near the hall's entrance, away from the remaining volunteers still finishing their work inside. "I have noticed your absence from recent gatherings," he said, his tone carefully measured, though something earnest beneath it caught Alina's attention immediately. "I hoped it was simply a matter of ill health, though I confess I suspected otherwise." Alina hesitated, unsure how much honesty the moment permitted. "It seemed wiser," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "to allow my sister greater opportunity for conversation with you, without complication." The Duke's expression shifted, something like quiet frustration flickering behind his composed features. "And is that truly what you believe I seek?" he asked. "Greater opportunity with your sister?" Alina's breath caught at the directness of the question. "I believed it was the natural assumption, given the circumstances of our families," she admitted carefully. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady and unwavering, before he spoke again, his voice quiet but certain. "I have attended a great many gatherings this season," he said. "I have spoken with a great many young women, all of them accomplished, all of them charming in their own ways. But there is only one conversation from any of these evenings that I find myself returning to again and again, turning it over in my thoughts long after the evening has ended. It occurred on a terrace, rather later in the evening, with a young woman who seemed entirely unconcerned with impressing me, and precisely because of that, impressed me more than anyone else I have encountered in a very long while." Alina's heart pounded so loudly, she felt certain he must be able to hear it. "Your Grace," she began, though she found she did not know how to finish the sentence, uncertain what protest or acknowledgment she ought to offer in response to words she had scarcely allowed herself to hope for. "I understand the complications involved," the Duke continued gently, before she could find her voice. "I understand what your family expects, and I understand the position this places you in. I do not ask you to resolve any of it tonight. I ask only that you not withdraw entirely from my acquaintance, on the mistaken belief that my attention lies elsewhere." Alina stood silently for a long moment, torn between the overwhelming relief of hearing her own suspicions finally confirmed, and the heavy dread of understanding exactly how complicated her family's expectations would make everything that followed. "I do not know what to say," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need not say anything now," the Duke said, his expression softening into something gentle and patient. "Simply know that I see you clearly, Miss Whitmore. I have seen you clearly since the very first evening we spoke. Whatever comes of that, I leave entirely in your hands." He offered a brief, formal bow, as though the intensity of the moment had not just passed between them, and returned to help the remaining volunteers finish their work, leaving Alina standing alone near the entrance, her heart racing, her mind spinning with the enormous, frightening, wonderful weight of everything he had just confessed. She walked home that evening in a daze, scarcely aware of the distance she covered, replaying his words over and over in her mind until they had worn themselves into permanent memory. He had chosen her. Not Charlotte, not the sister trained and polished for exactly this purpose, but Alina herself, quiet and overlooked exactly as she was. The knowledge filled her with a happiness she had never before experienced, and in equal measure with a fear so heavy it nearly matched it, because Alina understood with painful clarity exactly what her family would say, exactly what her mother's reaction would be, once the truth could no longer remain hidden. The days that followed the charitable gathering passed in a strange, uneasy quiet within the Whitmore household. Alina found herself unable to fully settle into either happiness or dread, caught constantly between the two, her thoughts drifting again and again to the Duke's quiet confession, to the steady certainty in his voice when he had told her he saw her clearly. She said nothing of it to anyone, carrying the memory carefully guarded within herself, though she found it increasingly difficult to maintain her usual composure whenever the Duke's name arose in conversation. Charlotte, sharp in her own way, despite the confidence that usually shielded her from doubt, began noticing small inconsistencies that unsettled her. She noticed the way Aliner's expression shifted whenever their mother mentioned the Duke's continued interest in the family. She noticed the faint, private smile that occasionally touched Aliner's lips when she believed no one was watching. And she noticed, with growing unease, that despite weeks of pursuing the Duke's attention through every proper channel available to her, their conversations remained consistently pleasant, but entirely without warmth, entirely without the particular quality of genuine interest she had once believed herself capable of inspiring in any man she chose to charm. One afternoon, as the sisters sat together in the small parlor working on needlework their mother had assigned them, Charlotte set down her stitching abruptly and studied Aliner with an intensity that made Aliner's hands go still over her own work. "Aliner," Charlotte said carefully, her tone lacking its usual light confidence, "I must ask you something, and I would appreciate an honest answer." Aliner's stomach tightened immediately, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Of course," she said. "Is there something between yourself and the Duke?" Charlotte asked directly, her eyes fixed steadily on her sister's face. "I have watched carefully these past weeks, and I cannot help but notice certain things. The way he inquired after your health when you were absent. The particular attention in his voice whenever your name arises in conversation. I am not a foolish woman, Aliner, whatever our mother might believe of my perception. I notice these things." Aliner's heart pounded painfully in her chest, torn between the instinct to deny everything and the growing conviction that continued dishonesty would only cause greater harm eventually. She thought of the terrace, of the garden path, of the quiet confession at the charitable hall, and found she could not bring herself to lie outright to her sister's face. "I have spoken with him on a few occasions," Aliner admitted carefully, choosing her words with painstaking caution. "I did not seek his attention, Charlotte. I promise you that. It simply happened without my intending it." Charlotte's expression flickered through several emotions in quick succession: surprise, hurt, and finally something that looked unexpectedly like weary resignation rather than anger. "I suspected as much," she said quietly, returning her attention to the needlework in her lap, though her hands remained still. "I have tried for weeks to capture his genuine interest, Aliner, and I have failed entirely, despite every advantage our mother believes I possess. It is rather difficult to accept that the one person capable of holding his attention is the sister I was always told mattered less." Aliner felt tears prick suddenly at her eyes, guilt and sympathy tangling painfully within her chest. "I never wished for this to hurt you," she said softly. "I would give anything to undo the position it places you in." Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the needlework without truly seeing it. "It is strange," she said finally, her voice quieter and more honest than Aliner had heard it in a very long time. "I have spent my entire life believing my worth depended entirely on capturing exactly this sort of attention, exactly this sort of match. And now that it has slipped so clearly beyond my reach, I find myself wondering whether I ever truly wanted it for myself at all, or whether I simply wanted it because it was expected of me, because our parents' hopes depended on it, because it was the only role I was ever taught to value." Aliner reached across the small distance between them and took her sister's hand gently, an act of genuine tenderness rare between them in recent years, buried as their relationship had become beneath years of careful family positioning. "I am sorry, Charlotte," she said softly. "Truly sorry." Charlotte squeezed her hand briefly before withdrawing it, composing herself with visible effort. "Do not apologize for something you did not choose," she said, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "Though I would ask you not to mention this conversation to our mother. She will not receive it well, whatever the truth of it proves to be." Aliner agreed readily, relieved beyond measure that Charlotte, at least, seemed inclined toward understanding rather than resentment. But the peace between the sisters proved short-lived, for Margaret Whitmore possessed a sharpness of her own, and it was not long before her suspicions, already simmering since the carriage ride following the garden gathering, boiled over entirely. The confrontation came nearly a week later, following a chance encounter in the village where Margaret, accompanying Aliner on an errand to purchase thread and ribbon, happened to witness the Duke himself crossing the street toward them, his expression brightening unmistakably at the sight of Alina, before he composed himself into polite, formal greeting. "Miss Whitmore," he said, addressing Alina directly, his tone carrying a warmth that Margaret, standing rigidly beside her daughter, could not possibly have missed. "I hope you have been keeping well." "Quite well, thank you, Your Grace," Alina managed, acutely aware of her mother's tense presence beside her. The Duke exchanged a few brief, polite words with Margaret as well, inquiring after the family's health and offering pleasant, unremarkable conversation for several minutes before continuing on his way, though not before his gaze lingered on Alina a moment longer than strictly necessary, a small, private acknowledgement that Margaret's sharp eyes caught immediately. The walk home was conducted in tense, heavy silence, and the moment they arrived back at the house, Margaret ushered Alina into the small study away from the rest of the household, her expression thunderous with barely contained fury. "I will ask you directly, and I expect complete honesty," Margaret said, her voice low and controlled in the particular way that Alina had learned over many years to fear far more than open shouting. "Has the Duke expressed some manner of personal interest toward you?" Alina's instinct was to deny everything, to protect herself from the confrontation she had long dreaded, but the memory of Charlotte's quiet honesty from the previous week steadied her, gave her the small courage necessary to face her mother's anger directly rather than retreat into further concealment. "Yes," Alina said quietly, "he has." Margaret's face drained of color momentarily before flushing dark with anger. "And you said nothing of this to me? To your father? Do you understand what you have done, Alina? Do you understand what you may have cost this family through your carelessness?" "I did nothing to seek his attention, Mother," Alina said, her voice trembling slightly though she held her ground. "I have tried repeatedly to withdraw myself from his notice, exactly as you instructed. I declined every invitation I reasonably could. I said nothing to encourage him. I do not know how to make his attention disappear simply because it is inconvenient for this family's plans." "Then you will try harder," Margaret said sharply. "You will refuse any further correspondence. You will decline any invitation where his presence is expected. You will make yourself entirely unavailable, Alina, until his attention returns properly to where it belongs, to your sister, who has spent her entire life preparing for exactly this opportunity, an opportunity you seem determined to steal from her through nothing more than quiet manipulation." The accusation struck Alina with painful force, unfair and cruel in equal measure, especially given Charlotte's own recent, private admission that she no longer felt certain she wanted the match for herself. But Alina understood from long practice that arguing further with her mother in this state would accomplish nothing beyond deepening the conflict, and so she nodded quietly, agreeing to comply, though something within her had begun, quietly and irrevocably, to rebel against the demand. "I am not trying to steal anything from Charlotte," Alina said softly, one final protest before accepting her mother's terms. "I have told her the truth myself, and she does not resent me for it, whatever you might believe." Margaret's expression flickered with surprise at this revelation, though she recovered quickly, her jaw setting with renewed determination. "Then Charlotte is more forgiving than I intend to be," she said coldly. "This conversation is finished, Alina. I expect your full compliance beginning immediately." Alina left the study that afternoon with her heart heavy and aching, torn between the genuine desire to protect her family's fragile stability and the growing, undeniable knowledge that something real and precious had begun to bloom between herself and the Duke, something she found herself increasingly unwilling to extinguish simply because her mother demanded it. Over the following days, Alina did as she had promised, declining invitations, avoiding correspondence, retreating further into the quiet corners of her family's household exactly as she had always been instructed to do. She told herself this withdrawal was necessary, was right, was the only path that might preserve some measure of peace within her family. But each evening, alone in her room, she found herself returning to the pressed wildflowers hidden carefully between the pages of her book, running her fingers gently over their delicate, faded petals, and wondering whether peace built entirely on her own continued invisibility could truly be called peace at all, or whether it was simply another name for the quiet suffering she had spent her entire life learning to accept without complaint. Nearly 3 weeks passed in this manner, Alina faithfully avoiding every opportunity that might bring her into the Duke's company, though the effort cost her more than she allowed herself to admit even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She grew quieter than ever, even by her own considerable standards, retreating so thoroughly into herself that even Charlotte began to express quiet concern over her sister's evident unhappiness, though she said nothing further to their mother regarding the matter, honoring the fragile trust that had grown between the two sisters since their earlier conversation. The Duke, for his part, did not pursue Alina through the usual channels during this period, sending no further gifts, extending no further private invitations, respecting, it seemed, the distance Alina had placed between them despite the evident cost it carried for them both. But absence, Alina would come to understand, was not the same as indifference, and the Duke of Ashworth possessed a quiet, steady determination that Alina's withdrawal had done little to diminish. The resolution came unexpectedly, on an ordinary afternoon that began with no particular significance attached to it. Alina had been sent into the village alone to collect a parcel of fabric ordered weeks earlier, a simple errand that required no particular ceremony, and one she completed without incident, walking the familiar path homeward with the parcel tucked carefully beneath her arm. She had not gone far along the quiet country road when she heard the sound of a carriage approaching from behind, slowing as it drew near, and turned to find the Duke's own carriage pulling to a stop beside her, the Duke himself stepping down before the wheels had fully ceased their motion. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone carrying an urgency Alina had not heard from him before. "I had hoped to encounter you, though I confess I had begun to fear you were determined to avoid me entirely." Alina's heart raced painfully at the unexpected sight of him, torn immediately between the joy of seeing him again and the fear of what her mother's reaction might be should word of this encounter reach her. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice unsteady, "I did not arrange this meeting." "I know you did not," he said gently. "I arranged it myself, having learned from a servant in your household the approximate time of your errand today. I hope you will forgive the presumption, but I found I could no longer accept the silence you have maintained these past weeks without understanding its cause more fully." Alina glanced anxiously along the empty road, though no one else appeared to be nearby to witness their encounter. "I have not maintained silence by choice, Your Grace," she admitted quietly. "My mother has forbidden further contact between us. She believes quite firmly that any connection between yourself and myself threatens my sister's prospects and the stability of my family's future." The Duke's expression grew serious, something firm and resolute settling into his features. "Then it is time," he said, "that your mother understood the truth of the matter directly, rather than through assumption and fear." Alina's breath caught in alarm. "Your Grace, please," she began, though the Duke shook his head gently before she could continue. "I do not intend to cause your family harm, Alina," he said, using her given name for the first time, the intimacy of it sending a small shiver through her despite the tension of the moment. "But I will not continue allowing misunderstanding to dictate a matter that concerns my own heart so completely. I have made my choice clear to you already, on more than one occasion. It is time I made it clear to your family as well, so that no further confusion or unfair suspicion falls upon you because of my own feelings." Before Alina could offer further protest, the Duke insisted on accompanying her the remainder of the way home himself, his carriage following slowly behind them as they walked together along the quiet road, and though Alina's anxiety grew with every step closer to her family's house, she found she could not bring herself to refuse his company, some quiet, hopeful part of her longing, despite everything, for the confrontation that now seemed unavoidable. They arrived to find Margaret in the garden, and her expression upon seeing the Duke's carriage draw up before the house, with Alina walking beside him, shifted rapidly from surprise to alarm to carefully controlled fury, all within the span of a few seconds. "Your Grace," Margaret said, her voice tight with forced politeness as she hurried forward to greet him, "this is a rather unexpected visit." "I apologize for the lack of formal notice," the Duke said calmly, though his tone carried an unmistakable firmness beneath its politeness. "I felt it important to speak with your family directly regarding a matter that has, I believe, caused some confusion these past weeks." Margaret's eyes flickered anxiously toward Alina before returning to the Duke, her composure visibly strained. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. "Please come inside. I shall have Charlotte join us immediately." "That will not be necessary," the Duke said, his words gentle but unmistakably clear. "The matter I wish to discuss concerns Alina." The silence that followed this statement seemed to stretch endlessly, Margaret's expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and dawning horror as the full weight of his words settled over her. Edmund, alerted by the sound of the carriage, emerged from the house at that moment, his own expression shifting to confusion as he took in the scene before him. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Margaret said quickly, her voice tight with barely contained panic, gesturing toward the house. The Duke agreed, and the small group moved into the modest parlor, Charlotte joining them moments later, summoned by a nervous servant, her own expression carrying a quiet, knowing calm that suggested she, at least, harbored no illusions about what was about to unfold. Once seated, the Duke wasted little time in coming to his purpose, his manner steady and direct despite the evident tension filling the room. "I understand," he began, "that there has been some assumption within your family regarding my intentions this season. I wish to correct that assumption clearly, so that no further confusion causes unnecessary difficulty for anyone involved." Margaret's hands twisted anxiously in her lap, though she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the Duke with desperate, careful attention. "From the very first evening we met, at your aunt's ball," he continued, addressing the room generally though his gaze remained steady on Alina throughout, "my attention was drawn, and has remained drawn, entirely to Alina. Not to any assumption of duty, not to any calculation of family advantage, but to her own quiet honesty, her intelligence, and her remarkable capacity for genuine observation and understanding, qualities I have found nowhere else so completely in all my years of society obligations. I have attempted, these past weeks, to make my interest clear through proper and respectful means, and I understand now that my efforts, rather than clarifying the matter, have instead caused considerable strain within your household, strain I deeply regret and wish immediately to resolve." Margaret's face had gone quite pale by the conclusion of this speech, her mouth opening and closing several times without producing any sound, while Edmund, beside her, appeared caught somewhere between shock and cautious, calculating hope, uncertain yet how this unexpected turn might ultimately affect his family's fortunes. It was Charlotte who spoke first, her voice quiet but remarkably steady given the tension in the room. "I confess, Your Grace," she said, offering a small, genuine smile, "this comes as no great surprise to me. I have suspected the truth of the matter for some weeks now, and I find upon reflection that I harbor no resentment toward my sister for it. If anything, I find myself rather relieved to discover that my own future need not be defined entirely. By securing a match, I now realize, I pursued more from obligation than from any true desire of my own." "Charlotte," Margaret said sharply, though her protest lacked its usual force, weakened considerably by the shock still evident in her expression. "It is true, Mother," Charlotte continued gently, her voice carrying a new, quiet confidence Alina had rarely heard from her before. "I have spent my entire life believing my worth depended on securing exactly this sort of match, taught to value myself only through the attention I could capture from others. But watching Alina these past weeks, watching her struggle against her own happiness simply because we were taught that happiness belonged only to me, has made me question a great deal about the expectations placed upon us both. I do not wish to marry a man who does not truly choose me, regardless of what advantage such a marriage might offer this family." Silence filled the room following Charlotte's words, and Alina felt tears welling unexpectedly in her eyes at her sister's unexpected generosity, at the quiet courage it must have taken to speak so honestly in front of their parents, challenging expectations that had shaped both their lives so completely for so long. Margaret, for her part, appeared entirely at a loss, her carefully constructed plans for the family's future crumbling before her in real time, though something in her daughter's combined honesty seemed, gradually, to soften the sharp edges of her initial panic into something more uncertain, more thoughtful. "I confess I do not entirely know how to respond to any of this," Margaret admitted finally, her voice quieter and more vulnerable than Alina had heard it in a very long time. "I have only ever wished to secure this family's future, to protect us all from the ruin that threatens us more closely with each passing season. Perhaps I have pursued that protection in ways that caused harm I did not intend, particularly toward you, Alina. I do not know that I can fully undo the years of expectation I have placed upon you both, but I am willing, I think, to listen more carefully than I have before." It was not a complete resolution, not yet, but it was. Alina understood, watching her mother's rigid composure finally begin to crack into something more human and uncertain, a genuine beginning, the first honest crack in a foundation that had shaped her entire life. And she found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowing herself to hope openly for a future she had never before believed herself permitted to want. In the weeks that followed the Duke's unexpected declaration, the Whitmore household underwent a quiet, gradual transformation, one built not through dramatic confrontation, but through small, steady adjustments in how each member of the family regarded one another. Margaret, though still prone to occasional anxious calculation regarding the family's finances, began to soften noticeably in her treatment of Alina, no longer dismissing her opinions so readily, no longer relegating her automatically to the quietest corner of every gathering. It was not a complete change, for old habits rarely surrendered themselves entirely, but Alina noticed the difference in small moments, a question asked of her directly rather than assumed unnecessary, a compliment offered without immediately redirecting attention toward Charlotte. Charlotte herself seemed lighter in the weeks that followed, freed from a burden she had carried so long she had scarcely recognized its weight until it lifted. She began speaking more openly of her own genuine interests, admitting to a fondness for painting she had long neglected in favor of activities deemed more suitable for capturing a husband's attention. And Alina found herself, for the first time, developing a friendship with her sister built on honesty rather than obligation, the two of them discovering, gradually, who they each truly were beneath years of carefully assigned roles. Edmund, for his part, remained quietly grateful for the unexpected turn of events, understanding well enough that a match between the Duke and Alina offered the family's finances the same relief a match with Charlotte might have provided, though he found himself, in unguarded moments, expressing something closer to genuine pride in Alina than he had ever previously shown her, a pride Alina accepted cautiously. Still unaccustomed to receiving such attention from her father after so many years of quiet invisibility. The Duke's courtship of Alina, once permitted to proceed openly, unfolded with a gentle steadiness that suited them both. He visited regularly, though never so frequently as to overwhelm the family's adjustment to this new arrangement, and their conversations continued much as they had begun, honest and unhurried, filled with genuine curiosity about one another rather than the careful performance Alina had grown so accustomed to associating with courtship. He took her, on one particularly memorable afternoon, to see the eastern edge of his own property, where the wildflowers he had once sent pressed between careful paper grew wild and abundant along a quiet stretch of meadow overlooked by nearly everyone who passed it. Alina walked among them slowly, delighted by their simple, unassuming beauty, and the Duke watched her with an expression of quiet contentment that told her, more clearly than any words could have managed, exactly how completely he had come to care for her. "You once told me that difficult things are not always unbearable," he said, as they walked together through the meadow, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden light across the grass. "That one learns to carry them. I have thought of that often since our first conversation." Alina smiled softly, recalling the terrace, the quiet ache of that early conversation, so different from the ease she felt now. "I believe I have found," she said, that some burdens grow lighter when someone else finally offers to help carry them. The Duke reached for her hand then, gently, and Alina allowed him to take it, the simple warmth of the gesture settling something deep and long unsettled within her chest. "I would like very much," he said quietly, "to help carry whatever burdens remain, for as long as you will allow me to." Alina's heart swelled with an emotion too large for words, and she found herself, in that quiet meadow, finally believing completely in the possibility of a life, where she did not need to shrink herself smaller and smaller to make room for someone else's shine. A life where her own quiet light was allowed, at last, to burn as brightly as it wished. Their engagement was announced formally not long after, met with genuine warmth from those who had come to know Alina through her recent involvement in charitable work throughout the county, work she continued enthusiastically even as preparations for the wedding began. Charlotte stood beside her throughout the preparations, offering genuine support rather than performed enthusiasm, the two sisters closer now than they had ever been throughout their childhood, bound together finally by honesty rather than competition. The wedding itself, when it arrived, was a quiet, elegant affair, smaller than society might have expected for a match involving a duke, but exactly the kind of celebration Alina herself would have chosen, filled with genuine warmth rather than empty spectacle. She stood before the gathered guests in a simple, beautiful gown, her sister beside her as her only attendant, and found herself, for the first time in her entire life, standing entirely in the center of a room's attention, no longer told to sit quietly in the shadows, no longer asked to dim her own light so that someone else might shine more brightly. The Duke watched her walk toward him with an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Alina felt any lingering doubt about her own worth dissolve completely, replaced instead by a quiet, steady certainty that she had, at last, found the place she was always meant to hold, not through chance or circumstance, but through her own patient, quiet strength, finally recognized and valued exactly as it deserved to be. In the years that followed, Alina became known throughout the county not merely as the Duchess of Ashworth, but as a woman whose quiet wisdom and careful attention to those around her earned genuine respect and affection from everyone fortunate enough to know her well. She continued her charitable work, expanding it considerably with the resources now available to her, and she made certain, in every choice she made as mistress of a great household, that no one within her care was ever made to feel as small or as overlooked as she herself had once been made to feel. Charlotte, too, found her own quiet happiness in the years that followed, pursuing her painting with genuine passion rather than obligation, eventually finding a match of her own built on mutual respect rather than desperate necessity, a match that allowed her the same freedom to be genuinely herself that Alina had discovered through her own unexpected journey. And Margaret, watching her daughters build lives so different from the anxious, calculated futures she had once tried so desperately to secure for them, found herself, in her own quiet way, learning something valuable about the true nature of worth, understanding at last that a daughter's value was never something to be measured against her sister's shine, but something entirely her own, waiting patiently to be recognized by those wise enough to truly see it. Alina Whitmore, once told to sit quietly and let her sister shine, had discovered instead that her own light, though quieter than most, burned steady and true, bright enough in the end to capture the attention of a duke who saw clearly what everyone else had overlooked, and strong enough to carry her, finally, into a life entirely her own. The years that followed brought further quiet joys to Alina's life, each one adding gently to the foundation she and the Duke had built together on honesty rather than performance. Their household became known throughout the county as a place of genuine warmth, where guests were welcomed not for what advantage they might offer, but for who they truly were, a reflection entirely of the values Alina herself had carried quietly within her long before anyone had thought to notice them. She continued cataloging the birds that visited the gardens of her new home, a habit the Duke encouraged with genuine enthusiasm, eventually helping her compile her careful observations into a small, private collection of writings that brought her a satisfaction she had never imagined possible in her earlier, quieter years. Visitors to the estate often remarked on the peaceful atmosphere that seemed to fill every room. A peace Alina understood came not from wealth or title, but from the simple freedom of finally being allowed to exist exactly as she was, without needing to shrink herself for anyone else's comfort. Charlotte visited often, the bond between the sisters growing steadily richer with each passing year, their earlier rivalry replaced entirely by a genuine partnership built on mutual understanding. The two sisters, once positioned so carefully against one another by their families' anxious calculations, became instead one another's most trusted confidants, sharing joys and difficulties alike with an honesty that had been impossible during their earlier years beneath their mother's careful watch. Margaret, in her later years, softened considerably from the anxious, calculating woman she had once been, her relationship with both daughters gradually deepening into something closer to genuine warmth, though the change came slowly, built through patient effort on all sides rather than any single dramatic transformation. She came to understand, in time, that the family's true strength had never depended on securing the most advantageous match possible, but on the quiet, steady character of the daughters she had, in her anxious years, so often overlooked in her desperate pursuit of security. The Duke remained, throughout their many years together, exactly the man Alina had first glimpsed on that quiet terrace so long ago, steady, observant, and genuinely attentive to the woman beside him, never once regretting the choice he had made so clearly and so early, a choice that had required him to look past the obvious shine of a room's brightest presence in order to notice the quieter, steadier light waiting patiently at its edges. And Alina, looking back across the years from the comfortable warmth of a life she had once believed entirely beyond her reach, understood at last the true lesson her own quiet story had taught her. That worth was never something to be earned through performance or granted through comparison, but something inherent, waiting only to be recognized by those patient enough and wise enough to truly see it. She had been told once to sit quietly and let her sister shine. In the end, it was her own quiet light, steady and true, that had illuminated everything that truly mattered, capturing not merely the attention of a duke, but the genuine, lasting love of a life built entirely on being seen, valued, and cherished exactly as she was.